Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Jai Janendra, and welcome everyone to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller, and more importantly, I'm joined today by my colleague, Melanie Barbato. Melanie is the author of Jain Approaches to Plurality, Identity as Dialogue with Brill, and the editor of Interreligious Dialogue and Diplomacy, a special issue of Cross Currents with UNC Press. She is a senior lecturer in history of Christianity at the Pacifika Communities University in Suva, Fiji, and coordinates the network of Hinduism in Dialogue at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies in the UK. Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, Melanie.
Hello, thank you very much and for the invitation, and hello to everyone.
We're so happy to have you here to talk about human security as compassion, a research area of yours and a course that you'll be teaching for us soon on the Arihanta Institute platform. And it gives me great pleasure to interview you today. Let me just get started by asking you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your education, your research background and interests, anything you want to share with them to get to know who you are as a researcher.
Yes, thank you. Before coming to Fiji, I did a postdoc and before that a doctorate in Germany, where I'm originally from. And my doctorate, it was on Anekantavada and the different interpretations of what it has meant in different centuries. And actually how I came to Jain studies was when I did my bachelor in the UK. I did a double degree in philosophy and religious studies. And at the same time, I was studying Western logic in the philosophy part of that. And I was studying Indian religions in the religious studies part of that. And this is when I came across the Saptabhangi and Anekantavada as part of a topic called Indian logic, like the crossover of both areas. And I saw that when I tried to look into that, I came across so many different interpretations of what they were meant to mean, from some very practical applications to some that were more like formal logic. And that's why I decided to do my doctorate on that. And in the beginning, I was very much contrasting the textual, classical Indian philosophy discourse with modern interpretations, which I thought were in a way like watering down the original meaning. But then when I actually went to India and I met Jains and I talked to them, I realized that my understanding has been very limited, because a philosophical concept, it has to be meaningful to the current generation also. And I changed my approach to a much more resource-oriented approach, or trying to understand what do these concepts mean to communities in different times. And this is how I became interested in something more like engaged Jainism, how concepts can have meanings in different contexts. And so security is one of the areas which come from that. How does it relate to maybe traditional concepts, but also how can it speak into very contemporary contexts? And how can we build bridges between them? And what do we have to be careful when we talk about these topics? So it's really an example of my wider interest in these kind of translation processes between different phases or different times.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate your work and your methodology so much, because as you know, when we read back into ancient Jain scriptures and then we look at the way that things are being practiced today, it can often be very different. And some people see that as some kind of corruption of practice or something. But I think I share with you the sentiment that it's actually a kind of evolution and changing of practice to meet the needs of the day, right? And so much of your work and your approach to Jain studies broadly is this very applied method, engaged method of trying to see how the community itself interprets these ideas and how they might help us solve some of the biggest questions of our time from the study of Jain scriptures. And so, yeah, and I can see why it is that you're, of course, teaching in the Compassion Studies Initiative, a course in Engaged Jain Studies with us here on human security as compassion. So with that being said, let me just ask you, personally, with your research background, your experience in life and everything, what does compassion mean to you?
I think compassion to me, like talking here more from life experience than from a research experience, it has two sides. One is the emotional side of being affected in some way by the suffering or the emotional state of other people, but it also has to have that inaction side. So compassion that just remains an emotional response that's self-indulgent in a way, and it's can be just a sign of a person being decentered by an external impact if it does not lead into something that actually serves others. So I think compassion is an interesting concept, especially in the context of religious or philosophical traditions, because it is very positive, but it also has a negative side in that it can be still a form of attachment that many religious traditions want to leave behind. So it's about not saying compassion is good or bad, but again, about finding the nuance and finding the proper ways of practicing compassion. So that's why I'm really interested in that compassion studies series, because I think that's partly what is being done here, to really look what can it mean in a meaningful way, to be both committed to a philosophy that teaches detachment, and on the other hand, to recognize the really important part that compassion and the service for others plays in the lives of Jains.
Yeah, I love that. It's like the experience of compassion within oneself that's triggered by some kind of external experience. You have some sort of intersubjective experience maybe with others who are suffering, whether human or non-human, should, in a sense, prompt us to some form of appropriate response.
Yeah, there is, I think, some of the negative form of compassion. I sometimes see on social media these videos where you see a poor person, and then it comes someone who gives them like $100 note or so, and you see how that poor person is suddenly jumping up and happy. And it's really voyeuristic, because it's kind of supposed to be compassion, but it's really just about making people feel good about themselves, but it's patronizing. So I think it's about recognizing these dangers, while at the same time upholding the real fundamental importance of compassion, and to work out how can we really practice compassion in a way that is liberating and not holding back or not feeding the ego.
Yeah, isn't that the fine line we walk between being attached to the outcome of compassion in the ways you've described, in the sort of voyeuristic ways, or acting out of self-interest and calling it compassion? There's some kind of fine line that's being walked here to actually engage in some form of action, as you said, compassion in action, to make that compassion manifest in the world in a way that helps others in a real kind of, I guess, powerful and true way that will be long-lasting and not attached to the ego. So the way you describe it sounds to me very much like a Jain approach to compassion when we read the scriptures, that even though we have to be detached from it, at some point, it's also seen as a transformative practice within the tradition itself that's almost necessary, right? To even start on the path. Part of having the right worldview is being a compassionate person. And I appreciate that very much. So you're teaching a course for us, and I'd like to give our listeners maybe a little bit of insight into what it is that you teach. And the title of the course that you're teaching in this regard is Human Security as Compassion, Jain Perspectives on Global Challenges. And we can see there that there's a focus on the human, there's a focus on human security in particular, and then also bringing Jain perspectives into dialogue with the many things that we face globally. Can you give us a kind of bird's eye view, overview of what this course entails? And then we can get into a little more specifics. What is this course about?
Yeah, I chose the topic of security because I thought about, when we are talking about compassion, what is one thing that really impacts people's well-being? And I thought feeling scared or feeling insecure, that's a really basic human need to have that mitigated, that fear. So I'm interested in human security because it is a way of thinking security that is not state-based, not just about armies and the protection of nation state, but it actually takes seriously the needs of the individual human being and then the human being in community. And I think Jainism as a path towards liberation, it also bridges these different levels, because it starts on the individual soul that is on the way towards liberation, but it also is about the Jain community. And then obviously also Jainism can also speak to bigger entities. So I thought it would be a really interesting conversation to bring this concept of security into discussion with the Jain approach to security, and to see in what way maybe there can be an overlap be discovered between the different concepts, but also how Jain approaches might differ in the understanding of security. Like, what does safety and security mean from a Jain perspective, and how can we connect the two? So human security, it typically has 7 subtypes. And in the course, I'm following these as the structure of the course. But something that is important for me is to say that these should not be seen in isolation, these different subtypes of human security. Like, we have personal security, health security, food security, environmental security, economic security, political security, and community security. And for that thinking of interconnectedness, I found also my background in Anekantavada very, very useful to think, how can we at one point we kind of split concepts, but how do we keep them together? So here also on that more conceptual level, I found it interesting to see how we can connect that with maybe Jain perspectives on how we should structurally think about challenges.
Fantastic. Yeah. So it sounds like to me from the title and overview of the course that a Jain compassionate response would include a serious consideration of human security, and that Jains have a particularly perhaps unique approach to this that could be considered in places like the UN, where we know that thought from Indic traditions has come through before. There have been, of course, those who identify as Hindu or yoga teachers who have come to the UN and shared their visions, and as well as Jain. We have Acharya Sushil Kumar and other big leaders. And so there's a place for the Jain perspective in these big conversations within the United Nations, for example, on human security. Tell me, is there a Jain equivalent to the notion of security or human security in Jain scriptures, and what might that be?
The work that I'm looking at, it's a lot about translation processes. So I think that Jainism has its own vocabulary to talk about the security challenges that maybe in the UN speak is done just with a different kind of sets of words, where both are complete in themselves. But when we try to bring them into contact, we have to think, how does the Jain tradition, maybe from a slightly different angle or so a different lens, already address these issues, and then to see for the legitimacy and to advocate for the righteousness of bringing religious terminology or philosophical terminology into these political spaces. And as I was looking at how can we think about security in Jainism, it's really the concept of ahimsa that is the strongest way of going into the discussion on security. And if you look, for example, into the dictionary, one of the few translations for ahimsa, it's actually not just not harming, but it's also security and safety as direct translations of ahimsa. And I think the starting point for Jainism for security is the recognition that all living beings that don't want to be harmed. And from this follows a duty to respect that, because they're sentient like we are. So security, it does not just apply to other human beings. It also applies, as we should be granting to all sentient beings that right for security. So it's in a way wider than human security. But at the same time, it is making a strong case for human security, because in that other human being, we recognize very strongly their similarity of fear, their emotional responses, the desire to live and to have a flourishing life. So from this in Jainism, I think comes a very strong tradition of calling for the respect for others' security, of not harming them, of providing them life circumstances which respect that they should be treated with nonviolence. And also the human security concept. It is a lot about the interconnectedness of different challenges and different responses. And I think you also have that in the Jain approach, so that if you basically harm the other, you're also in a way harming yourself. And the human security concept, it also shows that if you change one factor within the whole system, it might affect other elements in that system. This is why in the human security thing, you're working a lot with nexus approaches, that different elements of security have to be seen in interconnection. So here I also think in the Jain tradition, we have that understanding that the security of another person It's not just an isolated right that they have, but it's part of a more complete whole that has to be respected as part of the bigger order of the cosmos in a way even.
Yeah, it reminds me of the oft-quoted verse from the Tattvarta Sutra, Parasparo Pagraho Jivanam, that in some way all forms of life are somehow connected and in service to each other for better or for worse. And so let's do it for the better. This nexus you describe. I like how you connect the notion from the Jain tradition of this web of life in a sense with this nexus approach as you're describing it. Perhaps that's undertaken in places like the United Nations and trying to address human security, that it's connected to all forms of security. So there is a flow in your course, let's just say, where you're basically taking us through these 7 layers of security. And as you say, you're taking it through one by one, kind of breaking them up into parts because you can't go through all of them at once. So, but at the same time, the class kind of encapsulates a whole in the sense that you're going through all of them, and they're all, of course, related to one another. And so I just want to walk through this a little bit with you and understand what the Jain approaches to each of these forms of security might be and how it might manifest as some form of compassion in action. So you have 4 parts in your course, and the first part is dealing specifically with the first 2 aspects of security, personal security and health security. Tell us a little bit about what personal security and health security mean, maybe from the whatever more universal aspect we might be thinking about this from in the United Nations in a contemporary framework, and also specifically from a Jain approach. What would the Jain approach be to personal security and health security, and why should we consider these?
Yeah, so personal security, it's about people not wanting to be harmed. Like, it's probably what most people think about and when they hear like security in relation to their life, like not becoming the victim of violence or not being killed. I think that there's in human security that shift from the army approach, or that we're just thinking about states having security concerns, but still often we think in terms of personal security just about that real strong physical violence that is visible and that is like walking at night in the street and being attacked. While I think a more nuanced approach, it shows that there are often forms of violence that are maybe not as visible, like, for example, domestic violence, which is, it's not what people think about first, but it actually creates a lot of victims. And in Jainism, I think there's that recognition of all kinds of violence, like that violence starts even with thought process, that it starts with words, and it continues with killing small animals that might be considered negligible by some others. So I really think that approach of human security to go from that most visible level of war, of countries fighting against each other, which is obviously massively visible on the large scale, it's going to the more individual level. And I think the Jain tradition, it offers that insight that we have to go even further than that we even have to go to the kind of almost totally invisible or internal forms of violence. So that is something I really saw as an interesting point of connection here, that we have that basis of the ideal of not doing any violence at all as the ideal one. So the total respect of others' security. And it is, I think, a pretty radical approach in Jainism that is much stronger than the expectations that many other thought systems would have on the danger, on the problem of violence in the world. So I think that Jainism can really bring a strong commitment to the respect for other security, while at the same time it is a renounced tradition. So we find also that idea of those who have really gained a strong level of detachment, that they are not concerned about their own personal security anymore. So even going to that extent of opting to not self-defend in cases of attack. And this I find a really interesting spectrum of responses to the need to protect the individual body. And I think here we can also develop interesting discussions about what is the ultimate value of security, because in Jainism, the protection of the body might not in all cases be the ultimate goal when it comes to those people who have chosen to dedicate their life to the furthering of the soul, which might transcend these needs or these ideas, which obviously in these more political forms of security are considered the highest forms of security. So at the United Nations, there would not be a talk about the soul and the total renunciation of all self-protection in order to achieve that level of many Jain ascetics to even renounce self-defense. Yeah, so I think while we're trying to think how Jain tradition can speak on these stages like UN to these topics, it's also important not to purely equate it, but to keep the horizon of the whole tradition and the ultimate goal that in Jainism is not the protection of the body as such, but integrated into a wider philosophy, which ultimately is about the liberation of all souls.
Yeah, and what a tension there, yeah, that you describe. And it's good to, I think, acknowledge that we hear stories of the Jinnas, for example, Mahavira, just kind of allowing himself while he's trying to achieve his liberation. He's wandering for years and he's taking really the pain that's being inflicted upon him by others, human and non-human, without flinching. And so in a sense, he's kind of abandoned or detached from any sense of personal security for spiritual purposes. And on the other hand, any kind of violence that we take out on others, if whoever's inflicting violence upon him, is also doing something that will only beget more violence in the future through the laws of karma. And so it's this constant back and forth between us. So I hadn't thought about it too much that way, but it's I think an important nuance that you bring up, that the ultimate aim here is to detach from the body, but how many people are going to do that? Did you want to say anything about health security? I suppose that falls in under some of the same notions of what you're describing right now.
Mm. Yeah, there's a book coming out soon on how to not die too soon, it is called. And I read that the basic premise of it is that sometimes we are focusing too much on individual health issues, while really if we want to make a bigger impact, we should focus on pressuring towards good policy. And this is something else I want to discuss in this course, that compassion can sometimes come in unexpected ways. So sometimes it might be a form of compassion to call for policy change, as also Jains do on different topics. So compassion does not always be the obvious form of responding immediately to an outside stimulus of seeing a person in pain and then immediately acting. It can actually be more reflective to think, what are issues I care about? And how can I respond in a way that reduces the suffering in the world? So I think these kind of ways of reflecting and pausing, they can also show that detachment and spiritual maturity, they can go along with compassionate action. And something that I really would like the students, in a way, bringing together these two topics is to think about themselves. What does security or safety mean to them? And how do they balance these different understandings? In the one sense, living now in times where we have so many crises, where sometimes it seems to be you're just going from one crisis to the other. So what does security mean in the external world, these issues, but also internally, how can you get inner security? And these do not have to be in contradiction, but how can an inner security maybe lead to decisions that are more reflected and that can benefit not only oneself in crisis situation, but that can be compassionate, taking on leadership for the security of others.
Yeah, good point. And one of the things you raised there is with regard to the book, I think you said How Not to Die. And I believe that's the book by Dr. Michael Greger, if I'm not mistaken.
It's Devi Shrida.
Oh, okay, it's a different one.
I guess lots of people want to know how not to die too soon, so that maybe it's a good title because, as I say, it's one of the fundamental topics. So there might be several books going on that same title because it answers one of the fundamental questions. Ultimately, this security discussion, it's about fear of death, which is a policy matter, a logistics matter, but it's a deeply spiritual matter. When you think, what does people deepest fear? It can be that fear of death, what is happening after I stop existing. So much of that policy talk or UN talk, it might cover more deeply human fears about the meaning of life and the fear of a meaningless existence or the fear of existence ending. And I think religious traditions, they cannot only speak to the concrete issues, but they can also show the importance of always coming back to this fundamentally human level.
Absolutely. Yeah. So part of health is also being able to somehow, with security, approach the opposite when we're not in health as well. And a lot of that has to do with what we eat. And I'm bringing this up as a transition to the second part of your course, which is food security and environmental security. So the food that we eat and the environment that we're surrounded by definitely affects our personal security and our health security, right? So tell us a little bit about that, about food security and environmental security. Why are we teaching a Jain response to this? What would the Jain response be? Anything you want to share with us in that regard?
Yeah, I actually came to this security issue by participation in a project that was for developing a policy brief on the topic of food security with bringing religious voices into the discussion. And I guess I was the only person with a background in Jainism there, but so many times I thought and actually said about like, oh, this could be a really interesting contribution from Jainism. Because I think food security, like the need for people to have access to a healthy diet at all time, that's something that really Jains have thought about for generations. And one of the challenges is obviously now the sustainability. We have a growing world population. We are looking for more environmentally friendly or sustainable ways of growing food. And there, the Jain approach of replacing meat, which is not sustainable largely, with a vegetarian or vegan diet, that is one of the dietary shifts that are discussed more widely. How do you get people to do that? What are reasons that could motivate people? When you think about this discussion about sustainability, there are how do you keep people now at a level that they are happy or satisfied by still making sure that future generations also can benefit? And this requires a massive amount of convincing. Why should people care about future generations? What should be good reasons for this? And I think that sometimes philosophical or religious traditions, they really have a stronger basis for making these kind of arguments. And Jainism is particularly interesting, I think, because you have very rational arguments and you have a long tradition of making very clear arguments how this benefits your body, your soul, your ethical being. So I found it very interesting how Jainism can speak to the topic of food security. And connected to that, environmental security, I think as part of human security, obviously environmental security is not just about human beings. It's that point in the human security system that really recognizes the interconnectedness of the human being with the wider environment, that you cannot have a flourishing life in a situation where the wider ecosystem is not working. And this is also something that Jainism recognizes, that we are part of a bigger whole. It's not human flourishing cannot happen on the cost of other beings. And it might sound pretty obvious, but this is part of how our current age got into the trouble by not recognizing that fundamental reality at all. So again, I think this is something that the Jain tradition can speak to very well, the interdependency of different factors. Yeah, this is, for example, where in the UN we have this connection of water, food, and energy as three areas that have to be thought together. So that if you want to make sure that you have one in place in one area, you have to also always consider the other, because, for example, food relies on sufficient water, but the growing food also costs energy. How do you have sustainability with all of these? Yeah, thinking about, again, Anekantavada, the idea of the many-sidedness of reality and the interconnectedness of different aspects. I think that Jains have understood for a very long time that you cannot harm one aspect without impacting the other aspects of life, and that human beings have to see themselves as part of a bigger whole that is interconnected.
Absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to that portion of your class as well. And it reminds me, I was recently reading the work again when I was looking at Anekantavada of Piotr Balcerowicz. And in his work on Anekantavada, I was surprised to see when I was teaching another course on it, that some of the earliest tools of what would become Anekantavada, this notion of being open to multiple perspectives, were in fact simply to help avoid harm, for people to identify ways to avoid harm on their surroundings. And so it really sounds like you're focused on water, food, energy, and the way that the kinds of food that we eat. By focusing on those topics carefully, we can see where the opportunities are to increase human security by changing the way that we are at individual and systemic levels. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. And I know food and environmental security have been a huge topic in Jain studies for a long time. And this is really giving us a fresh approach how to look at it and apply it to like a real global set of circumstances. So I find it fascinating. Now, on top of that, in the next part of your course, you discuss economic security and political security, which are, of course, related to everything we've already talked about, but are themselves a nice pairing, the kind of two parts of a nation state, its economy and its political situation. What are the Jain approaches or approaches that you think are important here for ensuring economic security and political security from a Jain perspective?
Yeah, I think the pairing of the two is interesting because like money and power, these are things that from a religious perspective, they can often be seen as difficult or as challenging. So one basic question for Jains is, of course, should they stay away from these topics, or what is the right approach for them at all? And here, I think if we're talking about compassion in action, Jains across history, they have, and also today, they have shown that you can use these things for the greater good. Like we had, for example, Jain advisors to kings who were not withdrawing, but who were seeking, like, who can you talk to if you want to make an impact? Well, if you want to make life better for many people, if you can talk to the ruler of that country and convince that person to implement just policy, that is a good way of furthering compassion and action. Or the very fact that the Jains who are very advanced in their path, they're still bothering to teach others, that care for others. That shows also that withdrawal is not the ideal of the Jain tradition, but that we have that care for others, even if you're in a way already more purified in your own state. And similarly with money, it's clearly about recognizing the temptation that wealth can be, but rather than saying you just should give away all your money, it can be a balanced or harmonious way in which you dedicate your wealth to doing good in the world. And there are many examples of Jain organizations who do philanthropy and to support people in places where there is need. So I think here compassion actually can show how money and power, how it's about how you use them. And of course, also the recognition that while Jainism is advocating for that, not grasping towards either of them, it's still important to see how there is across history always some involvement with these topics, and how it's always recognizing that people don't want to be poor. There's a difference between the ascetic who is choosing poverty voluntarily and who is giving away in order to further spiritual progress, and a place where people are just poor because they cannot afford to feed the family. And it's again, I think that contrast we have seen before, that we have the disregard for the personal based on a choice of freedom, while at the same time honoring very highly the needs of families, of people, of the lay community who wants to not live in states of fear and insecurity. Because if you live in a way that you have to constantly worry about feeding your children, you cannot dedicate your mind to spiritual progress either. I think it can be a real help of compassion to recognize basic human needs, which is what the human security approach is all about. It's about recognizing the basic needs that have to be provided for to people so that they can live a decent, dignified life. And I think this can then be a good basis of asking for people to consider spiritual values and spiritual progress once these fundamental needs are covered. So much what might seem like a contradiction, it's really not a contradiction at all. It's about just considering the nuance and how they fit together. And this has happened across all of history. At the same time, caring for a flourishing lay community, while honoring very highly the very strong renunciation of those who really dedicate themselves to a life purely dedicated to the liberation of the soul.
Right. Yeah. So all of these are a kind of internal calling. Some people are called to renounce the world and to be supported within the community to do that, as you say, and they have the structure to do that. But as you say, most people need the basic needs met for all of the forms of security you've said. And I think you brought out a good point that the Jains historically and in the present in various ways have been so philanthropic in various aspects. So from the anthropological and cultural perspective, feeding the poor, providing education, providing healthcare, providing all the basic needs of things that people need in various ways. I'm thinking of Nitin Shah, who you and I both know, who is also teaching another course, who I also interviewed for the Compassion Studies Initiative, who goes and helps do voluntary healthcare all around the world. You know, he's dedicating his time in his retirement with his skills as a medical doctor to help others, raises money and funds to do that. And it's such an inspiring actual practice in light of all the principles that we've discussed in this interview so far, that I think are just so inspiring from the Jain perspective and can really maybe invigorate new conversations around economic, political, and all forms of security. So you've described in the first 3 classes all these various forms of very specific security. And I think the last class really ties a lot of this together through the last and final topic of community security. We're not doing this in isolation. You've said it so many times. We do have individual needs, but simultaneously we live in communities. And you say human beings, you know, they do not exist in isolation. And so what would a Jain approach be to to community security within the context of all the forms of human security that we've described? And what do you want to share with us there?
Yeah, actually, one of the key points I want to make in that community security section is for people to be confident in speaking with the voice of their tradition and to make a case to be included on policy tables, that their communities and their tradition have something to offer. And the human security approach, by including community security, it recognizes the importance for human flourishing for people to exist in communities and the right of protection for these ways of life, and how they're important for providing solutions. For example, when you look at COVID, who was stepping up when governments were still struggling to implement any kind of support, for example, in food security? It was largely religious communities who had that tradition already, or that practice of having big kitchens where they would feed people every week. So they could step up and provide food for whole communities outside their own community, to cities, to all kind of people in need. So it's not just for the sake of communities themselves to recognize the need of supporting and respecting them, but also it's for the benefit of the whole society to see that there are frameworks that give stability to communities. And I think for Jains to speak with a voice and to claim that their tradition has something to offer, that's a very strong point I would like to make, for example, on food security. And when I was talking about these translation processes, I think it's about finding a balance between speaking in terms that are understood by people, for example, in the UN and other places, but also to be confident in introducing new words or telling stories that might be a little bit unusual in these contexts. So, yeah, I think that that community aspect, for example, we have in food security, about food sovereignty, that food security, we should not only think in terms of nutrition, of calories, of logistics, of how to get food to people, but that it actually matters the ways in which communities have thought about their needs. So it's not enough that people are not hungry. It's important that food is brought to people in a way that is culturally sensitive. So these are cases that can be made very strongly for people and communities to have a say in their decisions for food. And this is especially in these whole discussions about dietary shifts, for example, now in terms of sustainability. So one of the things I think that are very important is for Jains on very pragmatic issues, like such as cultured meat, artificial lab-grown meat, to really call for labeling of these products that will allow them to make decisions about what they're eating, what are the elements there, and to speak as a voice of a community, say this is our community need, to have this labeled very clearly, or to advocate for certain policies. So this final class of mine is really about like thinking about what can this mean in practice and what action could be taken in that area.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it is always great how religious communities come together and have so many, as you say, kind of culturally specific ideas around food that cause them then and motivate them to serve food to those in need, and particularly during COVID, as you said. I remember in 2021, we did a big project with Jaina in North America. And in the lead up to the Thanksgiving holiday, we served 150,000 free meals to people who were in need. And that was done in, as you say, in like a very culturally sensitive way. There was no meat in those meals. I advocated myself as a vegan for them to be vegan. And so many people received the meal that they needed. And at the same time, the Jain community felt like it was doing a service that is just natural to its community service and security that they would do anyways. And that was sensitive to, their beliefs about food and all the ideas of ahimsa surrounding that. So it kind of tied together, I think, also many of the things you're talking about here in this class and with regard to community security. So I really appreciate having you on here, Melanie, on the podcast. And one thing I ask all of our instructors and interviewees and everyone we talk to here in the Compassion Studies Initiative is, how can our listeners start to develop more compassion in their lives? Maybe from your personal perspective or from the perspective of the course that you're teaching in your research. Is there some advice you can give to our listeners as we get ready to wrap up here?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest security risks I've read somewhere, it's actually the polarization of our societies. So it kind of ties in with the community aspect. And I think if we have strong communities who care for each other and who support each other, that's one of the best ways of making sure that people feel safe, but also that they are secure, because there are others who will look out for them in times of need. So my way of suggesting for creating more security, it's to counter that polarization by starting with oneself, to try to see what good values might there be in people who think differently. Like to really acknowledge what other people say, not to necessarily agree, but to have a more compassionate approach to the thoughts of other people. So myself working at universities, I find it really scary, the kind of threatening culture of conversation that is often happening. And I think that Jainism, with that big awareness of the multiple perspectives, but also the non-violence goes beyond mere physical violence. I think that is something that I really value. And the second point about compassion, like starting in the mind, starting in the way of speaking, and that contributing to security. It's about looking for role models, I think, in your own community. So I think to see what people do you admire, what they have done for others, and how can you inspire to be like them. So this can be people who are established leaders, but it can be family members or other young people who are really active and engaged in working for a good cause. So I think to look for these role models and then to team up with them, to join a good thing, to pick something that is meaningful to yourself. I think that is not only about compassion for others, it's also about making yourself more meaningful and more happy in yourself, and then also feeling safer that way if you have a true calling and purpose. So these would be my two recommendations on that one.
I think wonderful advice, and a theme that's kind of carried through these interviews is that when we give compassion and serve others, it makes our life meaningful and makes us happy and really makes life fulfilling. And so compassion as a spiritual practice, of giving up of a part of oneself for others, and not just humans, but all forms of life, can really be a way to live a fulfilling and meaningful life. I thank you so much, Melanie Barbato, for coming to interview with me today and for offering this course, Human Security as Compassion, Jain Perspectives on Global Challenges. We're looking forward to seeing that come out in early June on our platform, June 2025 at Arihanta Institute. And we thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Jai Jinendra.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum, spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more, can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.